In September 1944, as American forces prepared to assault the tiny coral island of Peleliu, Japanese intelligence officers distributed a chilling warning to their troops. The document, recovered months later from a destroyed command post, bore a simple yet ominous heading: Special Alert. Marine Units Identified. What followed wasn't the typical enemy assessment. Instead, it read like a survival manual for facing an unstoppable force. One passage stands out with stark clarity. The green-uniformed Marines do not retreat. They do not surrender. Prepare for close combat of unprecedented ferocity. This wasn't isolated fear-mongering. Across the Pacific Theater, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers recorded similar sentiments in diaries, letters, and official reports. One officer, captured on Saipan, told his interrogators something that stunned American intelligence analysts. When asked why his unit fought differently against Marines than against Army divisions, he responded without hesitation. "We knew the Marines would give no quarter, and we would receive none. They are not like your other soldiers. They are different." But what made them different? Why did battle-hardened Japanese veterans, who had conquered much of Asia and faced multiple Allied armies, single out the United States Marine Corps with such distinctive dread? This wasn't about firepower alone. American Army units possessed similar weapons and equipment. It wasn't merely about numbers. The Marines were often outnumbered by both Army forces and their enemies. Something else was at work. Something that transcended the conventional calculus of warfare. The answer lies in a complex web of tactical innovation, psychological warfare, cultural collision, and brutal adaptation forged in the crucible of the Pacific's bloodiest battles. Japanese military intelligence didn't just track Marine units. They feared them, studied them obsessively, and specifically warned their troops when facing them. Understanding why requires us to examine not just what the Marines did, but how they fought, how they thought, and what they represented to an enemy who valued honor and martial tradition above life itself. This is the untold story of why Japanese forces hated and feared fighting American Marines more than any other Allied unit in World War II. To understand why Japanese forces feared the Marines, we must first understand what made the Marine Corps fundamentally different from every other fighting force in World War II. The answer begins not on Pacific battlefields, but in the classrooms and training grounds of Quantico, Virginia, and the institutional culture that set the Marines apart long before the first shot was fired. In the aftermath of World War I, while most military establishments focused on trench warfare and European-style campaigns, a small group of Marine officers became obsessed with a problem that seemed almost theoretical: how to seize a fortified island held by a determined enemy. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Marine Corps developed what would become the cornerstone of American Pacific strategy, amphibious assault doctrine. Officers like Earl Pete Ellis studied every aspect of island warfare, from landing craft design to the coordination of naval gunfire with infantry advance. Ellis himself died mysteriously in the Pacific Islands in 1923. But his operational plans for seizing Japanese-held atolls proved prophetic. The Marines weren't just preparing for a possible war. They were preparing for the exact war they would fight. This preparation went far beyond tactical manuals. The Marine Corps institutionalized a philosophy that shocked even other American military branches. Every Marine a rifleman. Unlike the Army, where soldiers specialized heavily, some as cooks, clerks, or truck drivers with minimal combat training, every Marine, regardless of his official role, underwent intensive infantry training. A Marine cook was expected to pick up a rifle and join the firing line when needed. A Marine mechanic knew how to clear a bunker. This wasn't just about battlefield flexibility. It created a force where every individual saw himself primarily as a combat infantryman, with his other duties secondary. The training intensity reflected this philosophy. Marine boot camp at Paris Island and San Diego was deliberately brutal, designed not just to teach skills, but to forge a warrior identity. Drill instructors pushed recruits beyond what the Army considered necessary, instilling an almost tribal loyalty to the Corps and to fellow Marines. Where Army training emphasized individual competence, Marine training emphasized unit cohesion and an aggressive offensive spirit. The difference was philosophical. The Army trained soldiers to follow orders and accomplish missions. The Marines trained fighters to seek out and destroy the enemy with relentless ferocity. Compare this to Japanese military preparation, and a fascinating paradox emerges. Japanese soldiers underwent harsh training and embraced the Bushido warrior code, creating what should have been fearsome opponents. And they were initially. But Japanese training emphasized obedience to authority, group harmony, and spiritual preparation for death. Their doctrine relied heavily on surprise attacks, particularly at night, and on the psychological impact of suicidal charges. When these tactics succeeded, as they often did against unprepared colonial forces in 1941 and early 1942, Japanese units seemed invincible. The Marines, however, had prepared for exactly this type of enemy. At Quantico, instructors had studied Japanese tactics in China and developed specific countermeasures. Marines trained extensively for night fighting, not just defensively, but with aggressive patrolling that turned the darkness into their own weapon. They practiced small unit tactics that emphasized initiative at the lowest levels. A Marine squad leader didn't need to wait for orders from above. He was trained to assess the situation and act decisively. This decentralized command structure meant that even when communications broke down, which they frequently did in the chaos of Pacific combat, Marine units continued to function effectively. The Army, by contrast, trained for a different war. Their doctrine assumed large-scale operations in Europe, with clear front lines, reliable logistics, and conventional tactics. Army training was excellent for what it prepared soldiers to do, but it wasn't specifically designed for the savage, close-quarters, island-by-island warfare that defined the Pacific. Many Army divisions would adapt admirably to Pacific conditions, and some performed with exceptional valor. But they were adapting to conditions the Marines had specifically trained for. Perhaps most crucially, the Marine Corps cultivated an institutional identity that bordered on religious fervor. Marines didn't just serve in a military branch, they belonged to an elite warrior brotherhood, with a mythology stretching back to the halls of Montezuma and the shores of Tripoli. This esprit de corps, this unshakable belief in Marine superiority, wasn't arrogance. It was a weapon, carefully forged through training, tradition, and shared hardship. When Japanese forces encountered this combination of tactical preparation, aggressive doctrine, and unbreakable morale, they faced something unlike anything in their experience. The weapon had been forged. Now it would be tested in blood. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, marking America's first major offensive operation of the Pacific War. The initial landing met little resistance. Japanese construction troops fled into the jungle, abandoning equipment and half-eaten meals. For a brief moment, it seemed almost easy. The Marines secured the unfinished airfield that would become Henderson Field and began digging in. They had no idea they were about to face 6 months of combat so savage it would forge their reputation in the minds of their enemies forever. Banzai. Japanese High Command viewed the American landing with contempt bordering on disbelief. How dare this defeated enemy, still reeling from Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, attempt an offensive? Imperial General Headquarters dispatched Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki and 900 elite troops with orders to sweep the Marines back into the sea. Ichiki's unit had been chosen for their fighting prowess. These were veteran soldiers who had conquered Guam with ease. The colonel was so confident that he refused to wait for reinforcements, convinced his force alone would suffice. What happened next sent shockwaves through the Japanese military establishment. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki's men launched a frontal assault across the Tenaru River, charging toward Marine positions with fixed bayonets and complete confidence in their superior fighting spirit. The Marines, dug in with interlocking fields of fire and pre-registered artillery, annihilated them. When dawn broke, over 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Ichiki himself, surrounded and facing certain capture, burned his regimental colors and committed suicide. Of his entire force, only a handful escaped to tell the tale. A captured Japanese document from this period reveals the psychological impact. The enemy does not behave as expected. Night attacks that succeeded against British and Chinese forces result in heavy casualties. Enemy maintains discipline under fire and does not panic. This wasn't the assessment of a superior force. It was the confused report of an army encountering something unexpected. But the Marines' defining moment came in October, when Japanese forces launched a massive coordinated assault designed to recapture Henderson Field once and for all. Over 2 nights, October 24th and 25, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama threw 5,600 troops against a ridge south of the airfield, defended by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The Japanese attacked in waves, screaming, "Banzai!" and "Marines, you die!" As they charged through the jungle in the darkness. The Marines held. For 2 nights of unimaginable horror, they fought at ranges so close that muzzle flashes illuminated the faces of the enemy. Japanese soldiers broke through the wire in places, engaging in hand-to-hand combat in the Marine foxholes. Artillery fired at point-blank range, with shells detonating mere yards beyond the Marine lines. When ammunition ran low, Marines threw grenades and fired pistols. When grenades ran out, they fought with knives, rifle butts, and fists. Sergeant John Basilone, commanding 2 machine gun sections, became legendary that night. When his guns threatened to jam from overheating, he barrel-handed scorching metal to swap them out, burning his hands severely. When ammunition bearers couldn't reach his position through the enemy assault, he ran through fire to bring back belts himself. His guns killed wave after wave of attackers, creating fields of bodies so thick that later waves had to climb over their dead comrades. Basilone would receive the Medal of Honor. More importantly, his actions epitomized the Marines' refusal to yield even when outnumbered and nearly overrun. By dawn on October 26th, the ridge, forever after known as Bloody Ridge, remained in Marine hands. Maruyama's assault force had been shattered. Over 2,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead around the Marine perimeter. American casualties were severe but sustainable. More crucially, the Marines had held their ground against a force more than double their size. Japanese after-action reports from Guadalcanal mark a turning point in how the enemy viewed American Marines. One intercepted transmission from a Japanese commander to his superiors read, "The Marines are not ordinary soldiers. They defend to the death and counterattack with fury. Our night assault tactics are ineffective. Request different approach." Another report, captured later, was even more stark. Enemy morale remains high despite isolation and supply difficulties. Marines appear immune to psychological pressure. Recommend avoiding direct assault on Marine positions. The campaign ground on until February 1943, when Japan evacuated its starving, disease-ridden survivors. But the psychological die had been cast. At Guadalcanal, the Marines had established a pattern that would repeat itself across the Pacific. No matter how desperate the situation, no matter how fierce the attack, Marine positions did not break. Japanese forces had encountered an enemy that matched their fighting spirit, but combined it with superior firepower, better tactics, and an institutional refusal to accept defeat. When Japanese intelligence officers compiled reports on American units, Guadalcanal became the reference point for Marine Corps capabilities. The 1st Marine Division, in particular, earned a fearsome reputation. Japanese commanders planning future operations specifically noted when Marines were identified in the order of battle, adjusting their tactics and reinforcing their defenses accordingly. The legend had been born in blood and jungle darkness, and it would only grow more terrifying. When Japanese commanders analyzed why their forces suffered disproportionate casualties against Marines compared to other Allied units, they consistently identified specific tactical patterns that confounded their defensive doctrine. These weren't minor differences in style. They represented a fundamentally different approach to warfare that the Japanese military struggled to counter throughout the Pacific. Campaign, at the heart of Marine tactical superiority, lay their small unit leadership structure. While Japanese forces relied on centralized command, with orders flowing from senior officers down through rigid hierarchies, Marine doctrine empowered squad and fire team leaders to make immediate tactical decisions. A Marine squad consisted of 13 men organized into 3 fire teams, each led by a fire team leader, typically a corporal or sergeant. These NCOs didn't simply relay orders. They were trained to assess enemy positions, identify weaknesses, and execute flanking maneuvers without waiting for permission from above. This decentralized approach proved devastating in the confused, chaotic environment of Pacific Island combat. When a Marine patrol encountered a Japanese position, the response was immediate and coordinated. One fire team would establish a base of fire, pinning the enemy with continuous rifle and automatic weapons fire from Browning automatic rifles. Simultaneously, the other teams would maneuver left and right, using terrain and covering fire to close on the enemy from multiple angles. Japanese defenders, trained to hold their positions and wait for orders, found themselves under attack from 3 directions before they could react effectively. The contrast with Japanese small unit tactics was stark. Japanese soldiers were exceptionally disciplined and brave, but their training emphasized following orders and maintaining unit cohesion above individual initiative. When their officers were killed, a common occurrence in the opening moments of combat, Japanese units often became paralyzed, unable to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Marines specifically targeted enemy officers and communication lines, knowing that disrupting Japanese command structure would create cascading failures throughout their defensive system. Marine combined arms coordination elevated this tactical advantage to a devastating art form. From Guadalcanal onward, Marines perfected the integration of infantry, artillery, armor, and air support into a seamless killing machine. When Marine infantry identified a Japanese strongpoint, they didn't simply assault it directly. Instead, they called in precision artillery fire, coordinated through forward observers who moved with the infantry and could adjust fire in real time. Marine artillery doctrine emphasized responsiveness. Fire missions could be called in and adjusted within minutes, something Army units took considerably longer to accomplish. The integration went deeper still. Marine Corsair and Wildcat fighters provided close air support so precise that they regularly bombed and strafed targets within 100 yards of friendly positions. Pilots and ground controllers developed hand signals and radio procedures that allowed split-second coordination. One Marine on Peleliu described watching a Corsair drop napalm on a Japanese cave entrance while his squad was pinned down barely 75 yards away. The heat washed over us, but the Jap position just disappeared. 5 minutes later, we were moving forward. Japanese forces had no equivalent capability. Their artillery, when available, operated independently from infantry, with minimal coordination. Japanese air support was virtually non-existent by 1943, and even when present earlier in the war, it operated strategically rather than tactically, unable to provide the intimate ground support that Marines took for granted. This disparity meant that even heavily fortified Japanese positions faced a level of firepower they couldn't match or counter. The introduction of specialized weapons teams further amplified Marine lethality. Flamethrower operators and demolition engineers became integral parts of Marine infantry tactics. particularly in the brutal cave warfare that characterized battles like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The flamethrower, a terrifying weapon that shot streams of ignited fuel up to 40 yards, was uniquely suited to the Pacific theater. Japanese defenders hiding in caves, pillboxes, and bunkers were protected from conventional weapons but vulnerable to flame weapons that consumed oxygen and incinerated everything in enclosed spaces. Marine doctrine developed systematic cave-clearing techniques that became almost ritualized in their efficiency. A typical assault on a fortified cave began with reconnaissance to identify all entrances and firing ports. Marines would then suppress the position with small arms fire while a demolition team moved forward under covering smoke. Satchel charges, canvas bags packed with explosives, would be placed at cave entrances or thrown inside. After the blast, flamethrower teams would advance and pour burning fuel into the opening, followed immediately by infantrymen ready to engage any survivors. The entire sequence, from identification to neutralization, could take as little as 10 minutes against positions that might have taken hours or days to reduce using conventional tactics. Japanese defensive doctrine had no answer to this methodical combined arms approach. Their bunkers and caves were designed to withstand naval gunfire and artillery, with multiple feet of coral or concrete overhead. But these same fortifications became death traps when Marines employed demolitions and flame weapons. Japanese defenders faced a terrible choice: remain in their positions and be burned or blasted to death, or emerge to face overwhelming small arms fire. Either way, the outcome was usually the same. The Marine fire and maneuver doctrine deserves special attention because it represented a philosophical difference from both Japanese and U.S. Army approaches. Japanese tactics emphasized holding ground at all costs, with counterattacks launched primarily at night in massed banzai charges that relied on shock and fighting spirit. Army doctrine, particularly early in the war, emphasized careful advances with secure flanks and clear lines of supply. Marines operated differently. Aggressive, continuous forward movement with fire teams alternating between providing covering fire and advancing. This approach, called marching fire or walking fire in Marine terminology, meant that Marine units were constantly moving toward the enemy while maintaining suppressive fire. Individual Marines were trained to fire their weapons while advancing, using semi-automatic M1 Garand rifles that gave them tremendous firepower compared to Japanese bolt-action Arisaka rifles. A Marine fire team could put out 3 times the volume of fire that a similarly sized Japanese unit could manage, all while advancing rather than remaining static. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. Captured documents reveal that Japanese soldiers found the continuous Marine advance unnerving. They were accustomed to attackers who would go to ground under fire, presenting static targets. Marines, by contrast, seemed to absorb casualties and keep coming, their return fire never slackening, their advance never stopping. One Japanese soldier's diary, recovered on Saipan, expressed this terror. "They walk toward us, firing constantly. Our men shoot them and they fall, but others keep coming. There is no end to them." Finally, Marine logistics and medical evacuation, while not traditionally considered combat tactics, provided crucial advantages that sustained their aggressive doctrine. Marines placed corpsmen, Navy medical personnel at the squad level, ensuring that wounded men received immediate treatment and could often return to action. This contrasted sharply with Japanese practice, where wounded soldiers were often left where they fell, expected to die in place or fend for themselves. The knowledge that they would be cared for if wounded made Marines more willing to take tactical risks. Similarly, Marine supply doctrine emphasized pushing ammunition, water, and food forward to frontline units, even under fire. Japanese forces, by contrast, often operated on the edge of starvation, their supply lines cut by American naval and air superiority. A well-fed, well-armed, Marine could fight at peak effectiveness far longer than a starving Japanese defender armed with diminishing ammunition. When Japanese intelligence officers attempted to develop countermeasures to Marine tactics, they found themselves in an impossible position. Matching Marine combined arms coordination required air superiority they didn't have, artillery they couldn't spare, and a command philosophy that ran counter to their entire military culture. Adopting decentralized small unit leadership challenged the fundamental hierarchical structure of Japanese society and military tradition. The best Japanese commanders could do was warn their troops about what they would face and exhort them to fight harder. But fighting spirit alone couldn't overcome systematic tactical superiority, backed by material advantages and institutional excellence. The Marines hadn't just developed better tactics. They'd created an entire system of warfare optimized for the exact conditions they faced. And the Japanese military had no adequate response. When war erupted in the Pacific, Japanese forces held an unchallenged reputation for night combat superiority. Their victories against British, Dutch, and American forces in 1941 and early 1942 often hinged on devastating nighttime attacks that exploited Allied unfamiliarity with jungle warfare and psychological unpreparedness for close-quarters savagery. Chinese forces had learned to fear Japanese night infiltration tactics during years of brutal warfare on the Asian mainland. Colonial troops in Malaya and Burma broke and fled when Japanese soldiers emerged from the darkness with bayonets, fixed and voices screaming. The Marines would prove different. Japanese night combat doctrine relied on several key elements: intensive pre-attack reconnaissance, silent infiltration to close assault range, psychological warfare through noise and apparent chaos, and the spiritual conviction that Japanese fighting spirit would overwhelm enemy morale in hand-to-hand combat. The tactics had proven devastatingly effective, because most Allied forces, trained for conventional daylight warfare, panicked when attacked by screaming soldiers emerging from pitch-black jungle. Units would break formation, fire wildly at shadows, and sometimes retreat in confusion, even when not seriously threatened. At Guadalcanal, the Marines faced their baptism in night combat during those first terrifying months. Japanese commanders, confident in their nocturnal supremacy, launched repeated night attacks against Marine positions. The Battle of the Tenaru River, the assaults on Bloody Ridge, and countless smaller engagements followed the same pattern. Japanese forces would attack in darkness, often preceded by English-language taunts designed to unnerve the defenders. "Marines, you die tonight! Blood for the Emperor!" The psychological warfare was deliberate. Make the enemy afraid. Make them fire blindly and reveal their positions. Then close with cold steel. But the Marines responded with a combination that Japanese commanders hadn't encountered: absolute fire discipline, pre-registered defensive fires, and a willingness to engage in close combat that matched Japanese ferocity. Private First Class Robert Leckie, who survived Guadalcanal, described a night attack with visceral clarity. "They came screaming out of the jungle and hit our wire. We didn't panic. We didn't run. We opened up with everything: rifles, bars, machine guns, mortars. The noise was unbelievable, but every man knew his sector and fired into it. When they broke through in places, we fought them with rifle butts and knives. We wouldn't give ground." Marine defensive doctrine for night fighting evolved rapidly through hard experience. Units established elaborate defensive perimeters with interlocking fields of fire, barbed wire obstacles hung with tin cans and trip flares, and pre-registered artillery and mortar coordinates for every approach. When Japanese forces attacked, Marine artillery would drop shells in pre-planned patterns, creating killing zones that attackers had to cross. Machine guns were positioned to fire grazing fire, bullets traveling parallel to the ground at knee height, that would scythe through advancing formations. More importantly, Marines developed aggressive counter-tactics that flipped the psychological equation. Rather than passively waiting in defensive positions, Marine units sent out aggressive night patrols to disrupt Japanese preparations, ambush infiltration attempts, and gather intelligence. These patrols operated in the same darkness that Japanese forces relied upon, using stealth and violence to destabilize enemy operations. The hunter became the hunted. At Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese defenders launched a major banzai charge on the second night of the battle. Approximately 300 naval infantry attacked Marine positions near the airstrip, following their doctrine of night assault to the letter. What they encountered was the evolution of Marine night fighting capability. The Marines, alerted by sentries and trip flares, illuminated the battlefield with star shells from naval guns offshore. The attacking Japanese, suddenly exposed in artificial daylight, were cut down by concentrated fire. Some reached Marine lines, and hand-to-hand combat erupted in foxholes and shell craters. But the coordinated Marine response destroyed the attack. By dawn, nearly all the attackers lay dead. Marine casualties were comparatively light. The psychological dimension of night fighting cut both ways, and Marines suffered terribly from the stress. Men who remained calm under fire during daylight operations found night combat almost unbearable. The inability to see the enemy, the confusion of darkness, the screaming voices and explosions all around. These produced psychological casualties even among those not physically wounded. Staff Sergeant David Spencer, who fought on Saipan, later admitted, "I was more afraid at night than any other time. You couldn't see them coming. You'd hear movement, rustling in the brush, and you didn't know if it was one Jap or 100. Every shadow could kill you." Yet Marines developed psychological countermeasures that sustained their effectiveness. Unit cohesion, the bond between Marines in the same squad or platoon, provided crucial emotional support. Men fought not just for abstract causes, but for the Marine beside them. Knowing that your buddy wouldn't abandon you, that your unit would hold its position no matter what, created resilience against fear. Additionally, Marines cultivated a grim humor and aggressive mindset that transformed fear into controlled fury. One Marine sergeant on Guadalcanal told his men before an expected night attack, "They want to scare us. Well, tonight we're the scary ones. Tonight we're the devils they need to fear." The banzai charge, the mass suicidal assault that epitomized Japanese night combat doctrine, failed catastrophically against Marine defenses, precisely because Marines refused to panic. Japanese tactics assumed that the sight and sound of hundreds of screaming soldiers charging with fixed bayonets would break enemy morale. Against troops who stood their ground and maintained disciplined fire, banzai charges became mass suicide. At Saipan, in July 1944, Japanese forces launched one of the largest banzai charges of the war, over 3,000 soldiers and civilians attacking in waves throughout the night. They overran some Army positions, but when they hit Marine lines, the advance stopped. Marines poured fire into the packed ranks at point-blank range. Some Japanese soldiers reached Marine foxholes, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting ensued. But the line held. By morning, the entire Japanese assault force had been annihilated. A Japanese officer captured after Saipan provided revealing testimony. "We were told that Americans would not stand against a determined night attack, that they would panic and break. The Marines did not break. They killed us with machine guns and rifles until we were all dead or dying. Our doctrine failed because the enemy was not afraid." This assessment, from a professional soldier, identified the core issue. Japanese night combat superiority depended on enemy fear, and the Marines simply weren't afraid enough to break. By 1945, the transformation was complete. Marines had not only neutralized Japanese night combat superiority, they had turned it into a liability. Japanese commanders knew that banzai charges against Marine positions would result in annihilation, yet their doctrine and culture provided few alternatives. The Marines, meanwhile, had integrated night fighting into their standard tactical repertoire, as comfortable operating in darkness as in daylight. The psychological advantage had completely reversed. Now, it was Japanese soldiers who feared the night, knowing that Marine patrols might be out there, hunting in the shadows. Beyond tactics and weapons, the Pacific War was a deeply human tragedy, a collision between two warrior cultures, each convinced of their righteousness, each willing to die for their cause. Understanding why Japanese forces feared Marines requires listening to the voices of those who faced each other across bloodied coral and volcanic ash, men who survived to tell stories that reveal both the horror and the strange respect that emerged from mutual suffering. Private Tadashi Koshiishi, a Japanese infantryman captured on Okinawa, told his interrogators something that American intelligence found striking. "We were told the Marines were barbarians, criminals released from prison to fight. But when I watched them carry their wounded under fire, risk their lives for each other, I realized they had their own code of honor. They fought for their comrades as we fought for the Emperor. This made them more dangerous than we expected. They had reason to live, not just willingness to die." This observation cuts to the heart of a profound cultural paradox. Japanese military doctrine, steeped in Bushido tradition, emphasized death before dishonor, surrender as unthinkable shame, and life itself as less valuable than duty. Japanese soldiers were taught that capture meant eternal disgrace, that returning alive from a lost battle dishonored their families and ancestors. This created warriors of tremendous courage, but also tragic inflexibility. Men who would fight suicidal battles because their culture provided no honorable alternative. Marine Corps culture, by contrast, cultivated something different. Not a death wish, but a fighting spirit that embraced calculated ferocity in service of survival and victory. Marines were taught that every man was valuable, that bringing your brothers home mattered, that winning meant living to fight another day. The Corps' unofficial motto, "No better friend, no worse enemy," captured this duality. Marines would die for each other, but their goal was victory and survival, not glorious death. Captain Tsunezo Wachi, a Japanese naval officer who survived Guadalcanal, wrote in his post-war memoir about encountering Marine prisoners for the first time, "I expected to see defeated men, broken in spirit. Instead, even as prisoners, they maintained defiant bearing. One injured Marine, when offered water, asked first if his comrades were alive. This loyalty to fellow soldiers, even in captivity, was something I recognized from our own code. I realized we were fighting enemies who understood honor, even if they expressed it differently." From the Marine perspective, the enemy they faced provoked a complex mixture of fear, respect, and horror. Corporal Eugene Sledge, whose memoir With the Old Breed became a classic account of Pacific combat, wrote with raw honesty about the dehumanization that combat produced. The Japanese fought with a ferocity that was terrifying. They wouldn't surrender, wouldn't show mercy, so we learned not to expect or give any. But sometimes, in quiet moments, you'd find a dead Japanese soldier with a photograph of his family, and you'd realize he was just like you, a man far from home, fighting because he was told to. Then the shooting would start again, and you'd forget, because you had to forget to survive. The brutality was mutual and escalating. Japanese forces mutilated American dead and wounded, a practice that enraged Marines and led to retaliatory atrocities. Marines collected gold teeth from Japanese corpses, took skulls as trophies, and showed little mercy to would-be prisoners. This descent into savagery shocked even hardened combat veterans. Private First Class R.V. Bergen, who fought at Peleliu, reflected, "We became people we wouldn't have recognized back home. The things we did, the things we saw, it changed us. The Japanese would torture our guys, so we stopped taking prisoners. It became a war where mercy got you killed, and civilization just melted away in the heat and blood. Yet even in this hell, moments of recognition occurred. Lieutenant Satoru Omagari, captured on Iwo Jima, described his surprise at American treatment of prisoners. "I expected immediate execution, as we had been taught. Instead, a Marine corpsman treated my wounds. He was gentle, professional. When I asked why he would save an enemy, he said, 'It's my job to save lives. Doesn't matter whose.' This confused me deeply. How could the same men who killed so efficiently also show such care? I began to understand that perhaps we had been told lies about the Americans. The interrogation reports from Japanese prisoners reveal a consistent theme: surprise at Marine professionalism combined with fear of their combat effectiveness. One report from Saipan includes testimony from a junior officer who stated, "Marine soldiers are not supermen, but they fight as if they are. They use their weapons with great skill. When their officer is killed, they continue to fight effectively. This is their greatest strength. They do not become disorganized. We were trained to exploit enemy confusion, but the Marines do not become confused." Diary entries recovered from dead Japanese soldiers provide unfiltered glimpses into their psychological state. One diary from Peleliu, translated by American intelligence, includes this haunting passage: "We are surrounded, without food, without hope. The Marines attack every position methodically. We cannot stop them. My men ask me what we should do. I have no answer except that we must die well. But I confess here, in this diary no one will read, that I do not want to die. I want to go home. I want to see my wife again. But there is no home to return to with dishonor. So we will die here." Marine veterans, interviewed decades later, often expressed complicated feelings about their former enemies. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, before his death on Iwo Jima, told a reporter, "The Japs are tough, skilled, and brave. They deserve respect as fighters, but they won't quit, won't surrender, so we have to kill them all. It's them or us. Simple as that. I respect them, but I'll kill everyone I see without hesitation because I know they'll do the same to me." This mutual recognition of warrior qualities, even amid total war, reveals something profound about human nature. Two groups of men, shaped by vastly different cultures, found themselves in circumstances that demanded they kill each other without mercy. Yet they recognized in their enemies the same qualities they valued in themselves: courage, loyalty to comrades, willingness to sacrifice. The tragedy was that these admirable qualities led not to mutual understanding but to more efficient slaughter. The cultural collision between Bushido and Marine Corps values produced a particular intensity of combat found nowhere else in World War II. Japanese soldiers saw surrender as impossible. Marines saw the enemy's refusal to surrender as inhuman fanaticism. Japanese forces interpreted their willingness to die as ultimate proof of moral superiority. Marines interpreted it as proof that the enemy was crazy and needed to be exterminated. Both sides were wrong about the other, yet both were locked into patterns of behavior that made the war in the Pacific uniquely savage. The human cost was staggering. Marines who survived Pacific combat often struggled for the rest of their lives with what they had seen and done. Japanese soldiers who survived, very few, given their code, faced shame in their own society for having failed to die honorably. Both groups carried psychological scars that time never fully healed. In the end, the voices from both sides reveal warriors trapped in a machinery of violence, neither fully controlled, fighting with desperate courage for causes they believed in, and paying a human cost that strategy and tactics can never fully capture. War is fought in the mind before it's fought on the battlefield, and by 1943, the United States Marine Corps had become a psychological weapon as potent as any artillery barrage. Japanese intelligence officers didn't just track Marine units, they obsessed over them, creating detailed assessments that read less like military analysis and more like warnings about an unstoppable natural disaster. Captured Japanese intelligence documents reveal a striking pattern. When identifying American order of battle, Japanese reports used different terminology for Marine versus Army units. Army divisions were described with standard military language: unit strength, equipment levels, probable objectives. Marine divisions received special annotations. One intelligence summary from the Marshall Islands campaign includes this notation: 1st Marine Division identified. This is the Guadalcanal unit. Expect fanatical resistance. Recommend maximum defensive preparations and reinforcement of forward positions. The Japanese had effectively created their own mythology around certain Marine units, particularly the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions that had bloodied Japanese forces in early campaigns. These units acquired almost legendary status in Japanese military consciousness. A captured order from a Japanese colonel on Peleliu instructed his battalion commanders, "Intelligence confirms Marines, not Army, will conduct the assault. This changes our defensive requirements. Expect aggressive patrolling, heavy use of flamethrowers, and coordinated artillery. There will be no easy victory. Prepare your men for extended close combat." What makes this particularly revealing is what it says about Japanese perceptions of American Army units. The Japanese military respected Army divisions and fought them tenaciously, but they didn't fear them in the same way. Intelligence assessments of Army units focused on tactical capabilities. Assessments of Marine units focused on psychological preparation for their soldiers. The difference was subtle but profound. Facing the Army was a military problem. Facing the Marines was a test of will. Japanese psychological warfare efforts attempted to exploit what they assumed were Marine vulnerabilities, but these efforts backfired spectacularly. Tokyo Rose, the infamous radio propagandist, regularly targeted Marines with broadcasts designed to demoralize them. She would name specific units, claim to know their positions, and describe the horrible deaths awaiting them. 1st Marine Division, we know you're on Gloucester. The jungle will be your grave. Your sweethearts back home are dancing with other men while you die in the mud. Marines found these broadcasts hilarious. Rather than destroying morale, Tokyo Rose became entertainment. Marines would gather around radios to listen to her, laughing at her threats and enjoying the American music she played between propaganda segments. One Marine on Peleliu wrote home, "Tokyo Rose says we're all going to die here. She also said we'd all die on Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Saipan. We're starting to think she's bad at predictions. Also, she plays better music than our own radio stations." The Japanese military also attempted direct psychological warfare on the battlefield. Before attacks, they would broadcast threats in English, trying to unnerve Marine defenders. "Marines, you will die tonight. We are coming for you." On Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers shouted taunts about specific Marines by name, apparently gleaned from captured documents. "Sergeant Johnson, we know where you are. You will die today." Rather than frightening Marines, this tactic simply revealed Japanese positions and drew concentrated fire. The psychological warfare achieved the opposite of its intent. It made Marines angry, and angry Marines fought harder. American psychological operations, by contrast, weaponized the Marine reputation with devastating effectiveness. Intelligence officers deliberately leaked information about Marine unit deployments, knowing Japanese forces would intercept it. On Okinawa, American deception operations included false radio traffic suggesting Marine reinforcements were arriving when they weren't, causing Japanese commanders to shift troops to counter a threat that didn't exist. The Marine Corps' fearsome reputation had become a tool of strategic deception. More subtly, American psychological warfare operations used captured Japanese prisoners to broadcast surrender appeals to their comrades. These broadcasts were most effective when they emphasized that Marines, despite their fierce reputation, treated prisoners humanely according to the Geneva Conventions. One broadcast featured a Japanese soldier describing his surprise. I expected to be killed immediately. Instead, the Marines gave me food and medical care. I am alive, not tortured. Surrender is not shameful when facing an honorable enemy. While few Japanese soldiers surrendered due to deep cultural prohibitions, those broadcasts planted doubt about the propaganda their own military had fed them. Perhaps the most telling evidence of Marine psychological impact comes from Japanese military correspondence discussing unit morale. One remarkable document, a letter from a Japanese regimental commander to his division headquarters on Saipan, requested that his unit be repositioned away from the sector facing Marine lines. The letter, captured when the command post was overrun, stated bluntly, "My men's morale is deteriorating. They hear the Marines are opposite us. They remember what happened at Tarawa and Guadalcanal. I request we face the Army sector instead, where the men will fight with better spirit." The request was denied. There was nowhere to retreat to, but the letter's existence reveals how completely the Marines had won the psychological battle. Japanese soldiers, legendarily brave and conditioned to never admit fear, were openly requesting transfers to avoid facing Marines. Their commanders were acknowledging that soldier morale depended on which American units they faced. This represented a catastrophic failure of Japanese military psychology. The Marine mystique had become self-reinforcing. Japanese forces feared Marines, which made them fight defensively or desperately, which led to tactical defeats, which confirmed Marine superiority, which increased Japanese fear. By late 1944, simply knowing they faced Marines created a psychological burden on Japanese defenders before the first shot was fired. They prepared differently, fought differently, and expected different outcomes than when facing Army units. American commanders understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. Marines were often assigned the most heavily defended objectives, not just because of their amphibious expertise, but because their reputation itself was a weapon that softened enemy resistance. Japanese units that might have fought confidently against Army divisions became demoralized and defensive when facing Marines, creating tactical opportunities American commanders eagerly seized. The psychological dimension of Marine superiority was both earned and amplified. The Marines genuinely were exceptionally effective fighters, but their reputation magnified that effectiveness through enemy perception. Japanese soldiers facing Marines expected to lose, expected to suffer heavy casualties, expected no quarter given or received. These expectations became self-fulfilling prophecies as Japanese tactical decisions, made under psychological pressure, played directly into Marine tactical strengths. By war's end, the Marine Corps had achieved something remarkable. They had become a psychological weapon that defeated enemies before physical combat began. The mind game had been won decisively, and Japanese forces knew it. Their intelligence warnings, their propaganda failures, their soldiers' demoralization all testified to the same conclusion. The Marines weren't just tough fighters. They were the enemy Japanese forces most feared, most respected, and most desperately wanted to avoid. And that fear, as much as any tactical superiority, explained why Japanese forces hated fighting American Marines more than any other unit in the Pacific War. The Pacific War's bloodiest battles weren't random escalations of violence. They represented a deliberate evolution in Japanese defensive doctrine, specifically designed to counter Marine Corps tactical superiority. As Japanese commanders absorbed the painful lessons of Guadalcanal and other early defeats, they abandoned the banzai charge tactics that had failed so catastrophically and developed increasingly sophisticated defensive systems. Yet even these improvements couldn't prevent Marine victory, only increase its cost in blood. Tarawa, in November 1943, marked the beginning of this defensive evolution and remains one of the most brutal 76 hours in Marine Corps history. The tiny atoll of Betio, barely 2 miles long, had been transformed into a fortress by Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, who boasted that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. His confidence rested on formidable preparations. Thousands of tons of reinforced concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, coastal guns positioned to destroy landing craft, and nearly 5,000 elite Japanese naval infantry, the Rikusentai, considered among Japan's finest troops. Shibasaki had studied marine amphibious doctrine and designed his defenses specifically to exploit its perceived vulnerabilities. He positioned guns to create killing zones on the beaches where Marines would be most exposed. He built his bunkers to withstand naval bombardment, correctly predicting that Americans would rely heavily on pre-invasion shelling. He prepared his men psychologically, telling them they faced the Marines who had defeated Japanese forces at Guadalcanal, and that redemption required holding Tarawa at all costs. When the 2nd Marine Division hit the beaches on November 20th, Shibasaki's defenses exacted a horrifying toll. Landing craft hung up on an unexpectedly shallow reef, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards under murderous fire. Men fell in windows, blood turning the lagoon red. Those who reached the beach faced concrete and steel fortifications that had largely survived the preliminary bombardment. The first day produced approximately 1,500 Marine casualties, killed or wounded, in exchange for a few hundred yards of blood-soaked sand. Yet Tarawa also demonstrated why Japanese forces feared Marines. Despite catastrophic casualties, the Marines didn't break. They didn't retreat. They pressed forward with flamethrowers and demolition charges, systematically reducing bunkers one at a time. When conventional tactics failed, Marines improvised, using tanks as mobile pillboxes and coordinating with naval gunfire to blast paths through defenses. After 76 hours of continuous combat, Tarawa fell. Of the Japanese garrison, only 17 soldiers survived as prisoners from an initial force of nearly 5,000. Marine casualties exceeded 3,000, including over 1,000 dead, an exchange ratio that shocked the American public but validated Shibasaki's defensive concept, even in defeat. Japanese commanders learned from Tarawa. Static defenses could inflict terrible casualties on Marines even if they couldn't stop them. This lesson shaped the defense of Peleliu. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commanding Japanese forces on Peleliu in September 1944, took Shibasaki's concepts and refined them into a defense-in-depth strategy that would haunt Marine Corps planners for decades. Nakagawa largely abandoned beach defenses, knowing Marines would overcome them. Instead, he fortified the island's interior, particularly the coral ridges of the Umur-Brogel Mountains, creating a labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and firing positions connected by underground passages. His orders to his troops reflected a new philosophy. We must defend Peleliu not for days, but for months. Do not die in useless banzai charges. Kill Americans from protected positions, then retreat to fight again. This represented a fundamental shift in Japanese doctrine, driven directly by respect for Marine capabilities. Nakagawa understood that banzai charges against Marine defenses meant suicide. He understood that Marines excelled at combined arms warfare in open terrain. So he created conditions that neutralized Marine advantages. A close-quarters battle in terrain where tanks couldn't maneuver, where artillery had limited effect, and where every cave had to be taken by infantrymen willing to crawl into darkness and kill or be killed. The 1st Marine Division attacked Peleliu, expecting a 3-day operation. Instead, they encountered Nakagawa's nightmare defense. The coral ridges became known as Bloody Nose Ridge, as Marines assaulted fortified positions that couldn't be bypassed. Japanese defenders would fire from caves, then retreat through tunnels before Marines could retaliate. Flamethrowers and demolitions, usually decisive, proved less effective because cave systems had multiple entrances and ventilation shafts. Every yard forward cost blood. The battle lasted 73 days, far longer than any previous Pacific engagement. The 1st Marine Division suffered over 6,500 casualties, including more than 200 dead, from an initial strength of roughly 17,000, a casualty rate exceeding 30%. One regiment, the 1st Marines, was so devastated it had to be evacuated and replaced by army troops. Yet Nakagawa's garrison, which numbered about 11,000, was virtually annihilated. The colonel himself committed ritual suicide in late November as his final positions were overrun. His defense had inflicted tremendous casualties but hadn't prevented Marine victory. It had merely made victory more expensive. If Peleliu represented the perfection of Japanese defensive doctrine, Iwo Jima, in February 1945, was its ultimate test against Marine Corps capabilities at their peak. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding Iwo Jima's defense, had studied Marine operations extensively and possessed something rare among Japanese commanders: realistic assessment of his situation. He knew he couldn't win. His orders from Tokyo were simple: make the Americans pay such a price that they would reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. Kuribayashi designed his defense with cold-blooded calculation. He banned banzai charges outright, ordering execution for officers who disobeyed. He created the most sophisticated defensive network yet attempted: 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 rooms, with positions engineered for maximum killing efficiency and minimum vulnerability to Marine combined arms tactics. Kuribayashi's intelligence assessment of his enemy was brutally honest. In a letter to his superiors, he wrote, "The Marines are the most formidable troops we have faced. They will not be stopped by obstacles or casualties. They will bring overwhelming firepower and will not break psychologically. Our only chance is to make them pay so dearly that the American people lose their will to continue." This wasn't fear speaking. It was professional respect from a commander who understood exactly what he faced. 3 Marine divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, assaulted Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. The battle became the only Pacific engagement where American casualties exceeded Japanese. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 survived to be captured. Marine casualties exceeded 26,000, with nearly 7,000 killed in action. The fighting lasted 36 days of unrelenting savagery. Every one of the 2,500 defensive positions had to be individually destroyed. Marines earned 27 Medals of Honor at Iwo Jima, more than any other single battle in American history, testament to the extraordinary courage required simply to advance against Kuribayashi's defenses. Yet even Kuribayashi's masterpiece couldn't stop the Marines. His defenses inflicted horrifying casualties, but Marine combined arms doctrine, even in the constrained terrain of Iwo Jima, gradually overwhelmed Japanese positions. Marines adapted to each defensive innovation using flamethrower tanks, pole charges, and systematic cave-sealing techniques. When direct assault proved too costly, they bypassed positions and sealed them, entombing defenders alive. The battle's outcome was never in doubt, only its cost. Kuribayashi's final message to Tokyo, sent just before his death, captured Japanese commanders' evolving understanding of Marine capabilities. The enemy's fighting spirit is beyond expectations. Their use of combined arms, armor, artillery, aircraft, and infantry operating as a single weapon system leaves us no effective counter. Even our strongest defensive positions fall to their systematic approach. We have inflicted casualties, but we cannot achieve victory. The Marines are simply too professional, too well-equipped, and too determined. Okinawa, beginning in April 1945, saw Japanese defensive doctrine reach its ultimate evolution under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. Learning from Iwo Jima, Ushijima created defense in depth across an entire island, with multiple fallback positions and a garrison of 100,000 troops, the largest Japanese force Marines would face. His defenses incorporated every lesson learned from previous battles: interlocking cave systems, mutually supporting positions, minimal exposure to American firepower. and absolute prohibition of wasteful banzai charges until the final desperate moments. The battle lasted 82 days and produced over 72,000 American casualties, including approximately 20,000 Marines killed or wounded. Japanese casualties exceeded 100,000 military dead. The casualty ratios demonstrated that even perfected defensive tactics couldn't overcome the fundamental superiority of Marine combined arms doctrine backed by American material abundance. For every defensive innovation, Marines developed countermeasures. For every fortified position, Marines brought sufficient firepower to reduce it. Ushijima's headquarters, overrun in late June, yielded documents including his final assessment of Marine capabilities. "We have fought the Marines since Guadalcanal. Each battle, we have improved our defenses. Each battle, they have overcome them. We can make victory expensive for them, but we cannot prevent it. Their tactical flexibility, their refusal to accept defeat, and their overwhelming material superiority make them impossible to stop. We can die with honor, but we cannot win." This admission, from a commander whose forces had fought brilliantly and courageously for nearly 3 months, represents the ultimate vindication of Marine Corps doctrine. The Japanese had evolved their defensive tactics specifically to counter Marine capabilities. They had fortified positions with enormous effort and engineering skill. They had fought with extraordinary courage and determination. Yet at Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the outcome remained constant. Marine victory achieved through systematic application of combined arms doctrine, tactical flexibility, and absolute refusal to quit regardless of casualties. The cost was staggering. These 4 battles produced approximately 35,000 Marine casualties, including over 10,000 killed, representing a significant portion of total Marine Corps casualties for the entire war. Each battle became progressively costlier as Japanese defenses improved. Yet, each battle ended the same way, with Marine flags flying over objectives and Japanese garrisons annihilated. Japanese commanders had learned to fear Marines not because Marines were invincible, but because they were unstoppable. There was a difference, and that difference explained everything about why Japanese forces hated facing them. You could kill Marines. They bled and died like anyone else. But you couldn't make them quit, couldn't make them retreat, couldn't break their tactical system or their fighting spirit. In the end, Japanese forces could only choose how they would die, not whether they would lose. And that certainty, more than any tactical consideration, was what Japanese soldiers dreaded when they learned they faced the Marines. The Pacific War ultimately became a contest between 2 fundamentally incompatible military philosophies, each rooted in cultural values, institutional traditions, and strategic assumptions. Understanding why Japanese forces feared Marines requires examining not just what each side did, but why they did it, and why one system consistently prevailed over the other despite desperate courage on both sides. Marine Corps offensive doctrine rested on a deceptively simple principle: aggressive maneuvers supported by overwhelming firepower, executed by small units empowered to make independent decisions. This wasn't merely tactical preference, it reflected a distinctly American cultural emphasis on individual initiative, pragmatic problem-solving, and technological solutions to military challenges. A Marine squad leader encountering an obstacle didn't need to consult higher command. He assessed the situation, chose from his tactical toolkit, and acted. If his first approach failed, he tried another. Doctrine provided framework, not script. Japanese defensive philosophy, by contrast, emphasized predetermined plans executed with rigid discipline, sacrifice in service of strategic goals, and spiritual fortitude compensating for material limitations. Orders flowed downward through hierarchical command structures, with subordinates expected to execute them precisely even when circumstances changed. This reflected broader Japanese cultural values, respect for authority, group harmony over individual initiative, and acceptance of predetermined roles within hierarchical systems. A Japanese officer facing unexpected developments often couldn't adapt without consulting superiors, and those superiors might be dead or out of communication. The contrast manifested most clearly in small unit leadership. Marine fire team leaders, often corporals barely 20 years old, made tactical decisions that Japanese officers of much higher rank couldn't make without authorization. When a Marine patrol encountered a Japanese position, the squad leader immediately began coordinating a response. One team establishing suppressing fire, others maneuvering for flanking positions, perhaps calling for artillery or air support. The entire sequence might unfold in minutes, driven by junior NCOs applying doctrine to circumstances. Japanese units facing similar situations often became paralyzed when their command structure was disrupted. Marines quickly learned to target Japanese officers and radio operators first, knowing that destroying enemy command and control would paralyze entire units. This wasn't because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or skill, they possessed both in abundance, but because their system couldn't function effectively when the hierarchy was damaged. Individual Japanese soldiers, however brave, hadn't been trained to exercise independent judgment in the way Marines had. Material superiority amplified these doctrinal differences dramatically. Marines operated with the assumption of abundant supplies, reliable logistics, and technological advantages. Their tactics incorporated lavish use of ammunition, artillery, and air support because those resources were available. A Marine company commander facing a stubborn Japanese position could call in naval gunfire, airstrikes, and artillery bombardment before committing his infantry, and all those supporting arms would respond within minutes to hours. Japanese forces. By contrast, planned operations assuming scarcity. By 1943, American naval and air superiority had strangled Japanese logistics, leaving island garrisons isolated and undersupplied. Ammunition was rationed, artillery fire carefully conserved, and reinforcement or resupply impossible. Japanese doctrine tried to compensate through spiritual motivation. The Bushido Code, emperor worship, and acceptance of death. But fighting spirit couldn't overcome empty magazines and empty stomachs. This material disparity created a vicious cycle. Marines maintained peak combat effectiveness throughout extended operations because they were well-fed, well-armed, and could rotate exhausted units. Japanese units deteriorated steadily as supplies dwindled, casualties mounted, and no replacements arrived. By the final stages of battles like Peleliu or Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders were starving, armed with minimal ammunition, and operating with degraded effectiveness. Yet their doctrine provided no mechanism for strategic retreat or surrender. They could only fight until annihilated. The cultural dimensions ran deeper than tactics or logistics. Marine Corps culture celebrated aggressive action, problem-solving, and achieving objectives through whatever means worked. The unofficial motto, improvise, adapt, overcome, captured this ethos perfectly. When standard tactics failed, Marines tried something else. When equipment broke, they jury-rigged solutions. Doctrine was a starting point, not a straitjacket. This flexibility stemmed from American cultural values, emphasizing practical results over procedural correctness. Japanese military culture, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition and modern nationalist indoctrination, emphasized duty, sacrifice, and beautiful death over pragmatic effectiveness. A Japanese soldier who retreated to fight more effectively another day hadn't shown tactical wisdom. He'd shown cowardice. A commander who surrendered to preserve his men's lives hadn't demonstrated humanitarian values. He'd dishonored his ancestors. These cultural imperatives created warriors of extraordinary courage but tragic inflexibility. The institutional structures reinforced these cultural patterns. The Marine Corps promoted based significantly on demonstrated competence and battlefield performance. Officers who showed initiative and achieved results advanced. Those who failed were replaced. This meritocratic system, while imperfect, ensured that effective leaders tended to rise and ineffective ones were removed. The system rewarded adaptation and punished rigid thinking. The Japanese military's promotion system emphasized seniority, social connections, and adherence to doctrine. Innovative thinking was often viewed suspiciously as challenging established order. Subordinates who questioned superiors risked severe punishment. This created command structures where outdated tactics persisted because no one dared challenge them, where strategic mistakes couldn't be corrected because admitting error meant losing face, and where learning from battlefield experience happened slowly, if at all. Island warfare particularly favored the marine system. Islands were confined battle spaces where Japanese forces couldn't retreat strategically, where American material superiority could be concentrated overwhelmingly, and where tactical flexibility mattered more than strategic depth. Marines could surround Japanese positions, cut them off from reinforcement, and then systematically reduce them using combined arms tactics. Japanese defenders, locked into static positions by their defensive doctrine and unable to retreat by their cultural code, had no counter to this methodical approach. Moreover, the island environment rewarded the Marine emphasis on combined arms integration. In the confined spaces of Pacific atolls, infantry, armor, artillery, naval gunfire, and air support could all be concentrated on small areas with devastating effect. Marines had trained extensively to coordinate these elements and possess the communication systems to do so effectively. Japanese forces, lacking equivalent resources and trained in doctrines emphasizing infantry primacy, couldn't match this combined arms synergy. The logistics dimension deserves particular emphasis. Marine Corps logistics doctrine assumed continuous resupply from naval vessels, with ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies flowing forward to frontline units throughout operations. This logistical tail allowed Marines to maintain combat effectiveness indefinitely. Japanese forces, cut off from resupply by American naval dominance, fought with whatever they'd stockpiled before the battle began. Once those supplies were exhausted, their combat effectiveness collapsed regardless of their fighting spirit. The psychological impact of these systemic differences manifested in how each side approached seemingly hopeless situations. Marines facing desperate circumstances would reorganize, call for support, and launch aggressive counterattacks. Japanese forces in similar situations would prepare for final banzai charges or ritual suicide. One system sought victory even in adversity. The other sought honorable death. Against an enemy that refused to surrender, that distinction meant everything. By 1945, thoughtful Japanese commanders recognized their systemic disadvantages. Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima and Ushijima on Okinawa modified Japanese doctrine as much as their cultural constraints allowed, banning wasteful banzai charges and emphasizing defense in depth. Yet even these adaptations couldn't overcome the fundamental mismatch between systems. They could make Marine victory more expensive, but they couldn't prevent it. The cruel irony was that both sides possessed genuine military excellence. Japanese soldiers were brave, disciplined, and skilled. Marine were equally brave, but operated within a system that multiplied their individual capabilities through flexible doctrine, material abundance, and institutional adaptability. In the specific context of Pacific Island warfare, one system proved decisively superior to the other. Japanese forces feared Marines not because Marines were better human beings or braver warriors, but because the Marine system, doctrine, training, logistics, and culture operating as an integrated whole, was optimized for the exact warfare they faced. Every institutional advantage Marines possessed was an institutional disadvantage for Japanese forces. The battles weren't mismatches of courage or fighting spirit, but mismatches of systems. And in that systemic contest, there could be only one outcome. The statistics are staggering and sobering. Of approximately 485,000 Marines who served in the Pacific Theater, over 86,000 became casualties, nearly 1 in 5. More than 19,000 never came home. Japanese military casualties in the Pacific exceeded 2 million, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers dying in isolated island garrisons cut off from supply, fighting battles they knew were unwinnable. These numbers represent sons, brothers, fathers, men with dreams and families and futures that ended in coral sand and volcanic ash. The Marine Corps' fearsome reputation was earned in blood, and the price was paid by teenagers from Iowa and California, from Texas and New York, who found themselves fighting and dying on islands whose names they couldn't pronounce for strategic objectives they barely understood. Eugene Sledge, the Marine veteran whose memoir became essential reading, wrote decades after the war, "We won, and I'm proud of what we did." But anyone who romanticizes what happened in those islands doesn't understand. We became killers because we had to, and it damaged us in ways that never fully healed. The Japanese paid an even more terrible price, not just in death, but in the cultural tragedy of Bushido values twisted into suicide tactics that achieved nothing except prolonging suffering. Thousands of young Japanese men died in banzai charges that accomplished no military objective, sacrificed because their code provided no honorable alternative. The survivors who returned to Japan often faced social stigma for having failed to die. The cultural and psychological wounds ran deep. Post-war Japanese military historians, analyzing what went wrong, consistently identified Marine Corps effectiveness as a critical factor in their defeat. General Tadashi Hanaya, writing in the 1950s, concluded, "We believed our spiritual training made us superior warriors. The Americans, particularly the Marines, proved that professional military education, combined with material resources and institutional flexibility, creates more effective fighting forces than spiritual indoctrination." This was a painful lesson, paid for with hundreds of thousands of lives. Another Japanese analysis, produced by the National Defense Academy in the 1960s, examined specific tactical engagements and reached uncomfortable conclusions. Japanese forces consistently underestimated American Marines' capability and determination. Our intelligence identified their strengths, but our doctrine and culture prevented us from adapting effectively. We tried to counter a flexible enemy with rigid tactics. The predictable result was defeat, regardless of our soldiers' courage. These assessments matter because they represent honest professional reflection rather than wartime propaganda. Former enemies, examining the historical record with scholarly objectivity, confirmed what the casualty ratios had already demonstrated. The Marine Corps had developed a system of warfare uniquely effective for the Pacific Campaign, and Japanese forces had no adequate response. The legacy of Pacific War experience fundamentally shaped modern military doctrine worldwide. Marine amphibious warfare concepts, proven in blood from Tarawa to Okinawa, became the foundation for modern expeditionary operations. The emphasis on combined arms integration, small unit leadership, and tactical flexibility influenced military thinking far beyond the U.S. Marine Corps. Special Operations Forces globally adopted principles that Marines had operationalized in the Pacific: elite selection and training, mission-focused doctrine, decentralized execution, and culture of excellence. The U.S. military's entire approach to training NCOs, the backbone of small unit leadership, reflects lessons learned when Marine sergeants and corporals made battlefield decisions that won tactical engagements. Modern military education emphasizes initiative, adaptability, and mission-type orders that trust subordinates to achieve objectives using their judgment. These weren't theoretical concepts. They were tactical necessities proven effective in Pacific combat. Yet celebrating this legacy requires confronting uncomfortable ethical dimensions. The Pacific War featured atrocities on both sides, dehumanization of enemies, and descent into barbarism that shocks modern sensibilities. Marines collected gold teeth from Japanese corpses. Japanese forces mutilated American dead and murdered prisoners. The same men who showed extraordinary courage and loyalty to comrades committed acts that violated every standard of civilized warfare. How do we reconcile honoring veterans' service with acknowledging that combat transformed ordinary men into people capable of extraordinary brutality? There are no easy answers. Veterans themselves struggled with this duality. Many refused to discuss their experiences, haunted by what they'd seen and done. Others spoke openly, hoping younger generations would understand war's true cost and work harder to prevent it. The ethical complexity extends to how we discuss military effectiveness. This examination of why Marines were so feared necessarily focuses on their capacity for organized violence. We've detailed tactics, weapons, and methods designed to kill efficiently. There's a danger in celebrating this without adequate acknowledgement of what it meant. Thousands of young men on both sides, dying in agony, their lives ended or permanently damaged by the machinery of industrial warfare. Perhaps the most important legacy is the simplest and most often ignored. War is unutterably terrible, and even necessary wars fought by professional, ethical military forces produce human costs that statistics cannot capture. The Marines who earned their fearsome reputation paid with their psychological health, their innocence, and often their lives. The Japanese soldiers who faced them paid even more dearly, dying in circumstances of almost unimaginable horror, abandoned by their leadership, and betrayed by a military culture that valued death over effectiveness. Modern military professionals studying Pacific War campaigns should extract tactical and operational lessons. There's genuine value in understanding what worked and why, but they should do so with humility and respect for those who paid the price for that knowledge. Every tactical innovation described in these pages was purchased with human suffering. Every battle analyzed represents thousands of individual tragedies. The lessons about training, leadership, and institutional culture remain relevant. The Marine Corps demonstrated that professional military education, realistic training, empowered junior leadership, and institutional flexibility create effective fighting forces. These lessons apply beyond military contexts. Any organization facing complex challenges benefits from similar principles. But we must remember, these lessons were learned in circumstances we should work to prevent from recurring. Japanese forces hated fighting Marines because Marines were exceptionally effective at killing them and destroying their defensive positions. That effectiveness resulted from intelligent doctrine, superior resources, institutional excellence, and tremendous personal courage. But it also resulted in young men on both sides experiencing horrors that marked them forever, and tens of thousands who never came home. The reputation was earned. The price was terrible. Both truths must be honored. Veterans from both sides, in their final years, sometimes expressed similar sentiments. They were proud of their service, loyal to their comrades, and believed their cause was just. But they also hoped future generations would find better ways to resolve international conflicts than sending teenagers to kill each other on remote islands. That hope, perhaps, is the most important legacy of all.